welcome to KK Java Tutorials. In this video tutorial, we'll talk about proxy design pattern. First of all, we'll see all the concept related to this design pattern, and afterwards we'll see how we can implement it in Java, right? So let's see what is this design pattern is all about. So first point says the proxy pattern allows us to create an intermediary that acts as an interface to another resource and also hiding the underlying complexity of the component, right? Now proxy means, as you know, proxy means in place of, representing, or on behalf of, or literal meaning of proxy, and that directly explains proxy design pattern, right? Now next point says consider a heavy Java object like JDBC connection or session factory in Hibernate that requires some initial configuration, right? We only want such object to be initialized on demand, right? And once they are, we would want to reuse them for all calls. So in some of the scenario, objects initialization is very expensive, right? That takes a lot of resources, right, and time. Then what we want in first call, we want that object to be constructed, right, by reading the some configuration file or databases, right? And next time call onwards, we reuse the same object, and that's all about the proxy design pattern. Let's see how we can implement in Java. So here, just to save some time, I have already created this design pattern offline, and I will explain you each and every piece of the code. So first of all, we have one interface is called very expensive process. So we are considering this process is very expensive, right? Or you can say to call this process, right? Before calling this process, some processing happens, and which is very expensive process in terms of time consuming. It's very expensive, right? So when we use proxy design pattern, then how we can take advantage, right? So this is simple interface, and we required implementation of this very expensive process interface. So we have actually two implementation, but this is the original implementation, and there would be one proxy implementation, right? So here you can see I have created one implementation of this interface, very expensive process, and that's what we have overridden process method over here. And here we do some kind of processing just to save some time, or just to focus on how basically proxy design pattern works. I haven't written any business logic inside this, just I have written one message, process is done, right? So if you look into this, we have our default constructor, right? And within the default constructor, we are calling heavy initial configuration setup method. And here you might have lot of things like reading some property value from configuration file, or reading some data from the database, and just we are configuring, basically we are making ready to work our application. Those kind of expensive process happens here, basically initial configuration setup kind of stuff, right? So when you create basically session factory in Hibernate, right, before that we need to read some configuration file, right? So those kind of functionality you can write as one-time process, right? So this gets called from the constructor only, right? Now this is the basically actual implementation of very expensive process, right? So we can create one more class called very expensive process proxy, right? And that will implement the same interface. So that's what I have done over here. So I have given the name. You can see what's the naming convention I have followed. Very expensive process proxy, and that implements this interface, very expensive process interface itself. And that's what we need to override process method. And here you can see I have declared a reference of this interface, right? And as you know, there are two implementation of this interface. One is very expensive process proxy, another is this very expensive process IMPL. So here if you look into this implementation, proxy implementation, we have declared basically a reference type as a interface type, right? Now inside the process, right, in this we are checking if this reference is null, then only we are going to construct the object, and while constructing the object we are calling the actual implementation. This implementation, when we call this implementation, then internally from this constructor we are calling heavy initial configuration setup method, and this expensive process I want to be happen only once at the first time call, right? And afterwards, once this object is constructed, then our application is ready to call process method, and that's what we are calling this process method. Now we have a client program. In this client program I have created an object of proxy. Here you can see I am not creating an object of actual implementation. I have created an object of proxy object. I just assigning to reference type, interface reference type, right? So this interface is going to implement by these two classes, right? Actual implementation and proxy implementation, right? So in client program I have a reference of very expensive process. Now I'm calling the process method twice. So once we call this we create an object of basically proxy object, and when we call process method, so first time when we call the process method, right? So if you look into this, if you put cursor here and if you click on open implementation, then there are two implementation. One implementation is actual implementation, other is proxy. So in proxy class if you go, then we have a process, and here we have a kind of lazy initialization. So first time of course this reference would be null, then this object will be constructed and process method gets called. Now second time when we call the process method, then again same process method is getting called, because this reference hold the reference of proxy only, right? So if you look into here, there are two implementation, but proxy implementation will be called, and at this time this will not be null, right? In first call itself this gets initialized, then this part will be skipped, right? And if this part is skipped, then here this constructor will not get called and this method will not be called again, right? So this method will be called only once, right? And we are calling again very expensive object dot process. So if I run this application, then you'll see what the output. So if you'll see setup initial configuration is getting called only once, but process is done getting called twice. But here main thing is that our intention is to call this initial setup configuration only once, and that we achieved. So that is all about the proxy design pattern. Yeah, so I hope you understood. As far as source code concerned, I will post this source code on my KK JavaTutorials blog, and link I will provide in the video description. Before ending this video, let's see when to use proxy design patterns. So there are some key points you will have to keep in mind. First, when we want a simplified version of complex or heavy object, what we have seen in the video. In this case, we may represent it with a skeleton object which loads the original object on demand, also called a lazy initialization. This is also known as virtual proxy. Yeah. Second point, when the original object is present in different address space and we want represent it locally, right? So explanation is something like that. We can create a proxy which does all the necessary boilerplate stuff like creating and maintaining the connection, encoding, decoding, etc., while the client accesses it as it was present in their local address space. This is called remote proxy, and that's how you might have worked on RMI or EJB, right? So RMI and EJB, that basically creates a lot of proxy object, right? So that is built on the top of this concept only. Now when we want to add a layer of security to the original underlying object to provide controlled access based on the access right of the client, then proxy design pattern basically comes into the picture. Like you might have a various kind of functionality. You might have worked on the Unix, right? Unix basically on Unix we can do many kind of operation. We can do the read operation, write operation, update operation. But there is possibility there are certain group of people who are having only allowed for the read operation, but for deleting some resources and all that can be only allowed for the a group of admin, right? So those kind of functionality also can be achieved through proxy design pattern. So guys, that's all I have in this video tutorial. I hope you understood what is all about proxy design pattern in Java. If still you have any doubt or any confusion, then please let me know. You can post your query or question below to the video. I will try to answer. Guys, big thank you for watching this video and see you there in the next video tutorial.